Hey team, welcome to the channel. This is the part of the video when I'm about to sucker you in, tease you, tell you what this video is all about, ask you to subscribe and all that palaver. Forget all that, I'm just going to get straight into it. Today's vid is how to optimize Lightroom. 20 different things that you can do to make Lightroom run like an absolute beast. Love it, hate it, we all have some sort of love-hate relationship with Lightroom, but it's absolutely necessary, it's essential for the work we do. And when you're processing volumes, lots and lots and lots of photos, every second counts. I'm going to take you through 20 things that you can do to just get the best out of Lightroom. And I guarantee you'll see some improvements with some of these tweaks. I'm going to take these 20 things and I'm going to break them down into 4 different parts. The first one is computer geekery, essentially hardware. Hardware changes or improvements you can make that make it run better. The second one is catalog settings. Settings, tweaks, changes you can make to your catalog specifically, just to make it run a little bit smoother. The third one is performance settings, other settings that you can change within Lightroom that aren't necessarily related to your catalog. And the fourth one are workflow improvements. There are changes to the way that you do things in Lightroom that can actually help it run faster. So, let's get straight into it. So we're talking about hardware, and the first thing we need to concern ourselves with is RAM, memory. Have you got enough memory? Now I've been using Lightroom for some time now, sort of hovering around the 21 gig mark. Right now I'm running a slideshow and I'm exporting some files and I've been doing some editing. That's way more than 16 gig. So if you can, get yourself up to at least 32 gig of RAM. And if you can go higher than that, if you can go 64, I think you'll be in a better place. The second thing is hard drives. You get told it all the time that SSDs are so much faster. SSDs are so much faster for running your OS, for loading your Lightroom catalog on, and if you can, keeping your raw files on there. Now, the trick is to make use of SSDs when and how you can, and I realize that not all of us run computers that enable us to run 1, 2, or even 3 multiple SSDs. But if you can make sure that your core drive, the one that's running your OS and your programs, is an SSD at the very least, awesome. The next thing you can do is you can ensure that your catalog, that Lightroom is constantly reading to and writing from, ensure that that's on an SSD, amazing. If you can go one step further and have your previews or your raw files on an SSD, way better place. The speed difference between a spinning drive and an SSD is just remarkable. And Lightroom will run so much better if you get your catalog and your raw files onto an SSD. Plain and simple, go and do it. Staying on the subject of drives, do your absolute best to not rely on external drives when you're processing. External drives are wonderful things. I have a whole lot of them that I use for backup and storage purposes. But at the end of the day, you're doing yourself a disservice if you're plugging in an external drive of any capacity and editing on that. Do your best to keep your catalogs, your previews, and if possible your raw files on a local drive on your local computer. It's that simple. And then the fourth hardware tip is a little bit of a funny one. Truthfully, don't have too big a display. I know this sounds a little bit crazy, and I know what we want is we want big displays with heaps and heaps of pixels and heaps of real estate. I get it. But the problem is that Lightroom actually struggles to display your images on massive big 4K displays. So you think you're doing yourself a favor by buying a fancy 4K display. The truth is you might be slowing Lightroom down. Unless you have a GPU, a graphics processing unit, a graphics card that can back up that display. So if you've got a big display, make sure you've got a big grunty graphics card to actually power it. If not, maybe you want to consider doing your editing on a slightly smaller display. Maybe you don't need that 4K display for all that editing. Just a thought. Now we're moving now on to catalog settings. These are changes that you can make within your catalog that might give you some improvements. Your workflow may not work for this idea, but it's generally agreed that as Lightroom catalogs get too big, they slow down. And the truth is that makes a hell of a lot of sense. A Lightroom catalog is just a massive big database. The more that's in there, the slower it's going to take to read and write to it, just generally. So it pays to create new Lightroom catalogs from time to time. Now, how often you do that is completely up to you. Some people like to have new catalogs for every single job they do. Personally, I find that a little bit over the top because I like to keep my seasonal work together. So I create a new catalog every season. For me, my season is over the summer, which is effectively from August through to July. So every August, I buy a new drive, pop it in my computer, create a new catalog, and I start afresh. And there's a noticeable difference for me in how the catalog performs in, let's say, October, November, compared to May or June when I'm shooting some of the last weddings of the summer. There's a noticeable difference, and I look forward to that time of the year when I can start afresh with a new catalogue. One way to overcome this, if you don't want to use new catalogues, i.e. let's say you want to keep all of your work for not only a season but a lifetime in one catalogue, fine, you might have reasons for doing that, but consider my previous video, which I'll link to in the description. Consider the way that you can export data out of that into a brand new, small, tiny Lightroom catalogue. Then you're working on this amazingly minute, small, and optimized catalogue for the work you need to do, and then when you're finished, you import it back into your big one. Makes a hell of a lot of sense. Go check that video out if you don't know what I'm talking about. There's another thing I recommend you do in your catalogue, and you do it as often as you can, as often as your workflow allows, and that's to run the optimize catalogue function within Lightroom. It's built right into it. It's there for you to use. Go and use it. It's under File, Optimize Catalogue. Your catalogue was last optimized, well for me it was a few days ago. Let's do it again. Now Lightroom will go out of action for that, and depending on the size of your catalogue, effectively depends on how long this takes. That makes a lot of sense. It may take several minutes, and if you've got a big catalogue, actually may take more than several minutes, may take several minutes. Let it happen. Let it do its thing. If you've got a catalogue where you haven't run this on, or a catalogue that's big, I guarantee you that when you run this, you will notice a difference afterwards. So go ahead and give it a go. However, if you want the next tip is to run that optimization as often as possible. And how do we do it? We run it on exit when we run a backup. So my favorite setting in Lightroom to choose is this one. Edit, Catalog Settings, back up my catalogue every time Lightroom exits. Every single time I close down Lightroom, I get presented with this prompt. And this prompt says, hey, I'm going to back it up. I'm going to back it up to another drive, not the drive that my catalogue is actually on at the moment. For me, that's really important. I'm putting it somewhere else. I'm building redundancy into this process. You'll notice for me it's on Dropbox, which means it's then synced in the cloud and across all of my other devices. And here's the key. I'm ticking this Optimize Catalog button. By ticking that button, I run the Optimize function. So I effectively optimize my catalog multiple times a day, every time I close Lightroom. Now, sometimes if I'm in an editing marathon, it might be once a day at the end of the day, but quite often I'm in and out of my catalog multiple times a day. What's it take right now in this catalog? A minute at most. Boom. I know that my catalog is optimum. The next one is a really, really interesting tip. And when I found this out and I tested it myself, I couldn't believe that we don't get told this more often. It seems like a no-brainer now. But let me ask you a question. How many presets have you bought, downloaded, or built over the years? And are they all still there in Lightroom? Second question. How many of those are you actually using on a regular basis? If you're anything like me and my bad habits, I had thousands of presets and I used about 3. The truth is that those thousands of presets, they're slowing down your Lightroom. Now, see all of these presets that I've got going on here? Some of them old, some of them new, some of them from times when I was into different things. Every single one of these presets needs a little wee image or preview or JPEG or whatever you want to call it created for every single one of these. It sits in the background so that when I hover it over it like this, it's got something to display. Look at that. Look at how quickly Lightroom can show these. But all of the images for all of these presets certainly adds up from a performance perspective, because Lightroom needs to do this for all of the photos. Now, I can't believe I'm showing you these, but let's be honest, we've all been there, right? Now, what's the magic number? I don't know, but I've read a few things that say that over 2,000 presets really starts to cause a problem. And I've chatted to numerous photographers who've said, yeah, they had too many presets. They took them out, they reduced it, they refined it down to like the 3, 4, 5, 6 they need, and boom. Lightroom was dramatically different. Truth is that this is all I need. I'm only really using 2 or 3 presets, right? And I'm sure you kind of are as well. A few presets here that I might jump between, some of the default ones that came with Lightroom, and a couple of other things I've made. That's all we need. Keep your presets really minimal, really simple. Don't be afraid to try new things, but if they're not working for you, if you don't like them, rip them out, get rid of them. Lightroom will run so much faster without them. So now I want to move into performance settings. Other things that you can tweak, things you can change. They're all within Lightroom, but they're things that you may not have been aware of. You may not have seen these before. Let's give them a go. All right, what we're going to do now is we're going to increase the ACR cache. ACR, if you don't know, is Adobe Camera Raw. And there's a default setting in Lightroom when you basically have a brand new install of Lightroom. You can go and you can change that cache number. Let's go check it out. Here under Edit, Preferences, and then going into Performance, there's a Camera raw cache settings option here. And there are actually three things that we can do. The first thing we can do is we can choose to purge the cache. Now, what difference does it make? I don't know, but let's do it today anyway. Second thing we can do is we can change the size of this cache. By default, it's potentially not enough. Now, if you're anything like me, you've got gigs and gigs, in fact hundreds of gigs worth of hard drive space available. Let's use it. Let's change this to 20, 25. In fact, let's make it 30 gig. 30 gig camera raw cache. The next thing we can choose to do is we can choose to be a little bit sneaky and a little bit specific about where that cache sits. Now for me, I'm going to leave it on my C drive. That's my fastest drive on my computer, and all it's got on it is my OS and my Lightroom. I don't have any catalogues or any raw files on it. I'm going to leave it there. But in your case, it might be different. Maybe your main drive isn't an SSD, but you've got an SSD for your catalog or something. Maybe you want to point your raw cache to that place. So have a think about the fastest drive in your computer for your cache. Make sure it sits there. The next one's a little bit weird, right? And it's a little bit counterintuitive. And it's do use the GPU, or hang on, don't use the GPU. I'm going to leave you to play with this one and figure out what makes more sense for you and your computer setup. But I'll show you exactly what I mean. Under Edit, Preferences, and then back under Performance, you'll see here, Camera Raw Use Graphics Processor. I've got a reasonably good graphics card in here, right? It's a GTX 2070. It's not top of the range, but it's pretty damn good. By default, Lightroom will have Auto as the option for using graphics processor. But if you're in a situation where you notice that things aren't running that well, it would pay for you to come in here and actually change this. Turn it off. Completely turn it off. Graphics acceleration is disabled. We actually know that Lightroom does not make very good use of graphics acceleration. It doesn't actually make optimum use of your GPU. Now, they're working on it. I'm sure that in a couple of years it will, but right now it doesn't. And so there are actually situations where you're trying to do certain things in Lightroom, and if your GPU is not very good, Lightroom will try to use it and not get the most out of it. It'll actually hold you back. In some situations, you may want to turn that off. Then you've got the option to come in here and actually choose a custom setting. We've got two tick boxes here, and one follows the other, but we can turn the GPU for image processing. We can turn that off and don't use it for processing, only use it for display. Or we can turn that off completely, effectively the same as us going and choosing this to off. So you'll see here that we've sort of got 3 or 4 options. Now, I leave mine at auto and I let Lightroom make a decision because I don't really have a fundamental problem with the way that it uses my GPU. But my suggestion for you is that you play around with this setting in isolation. Remember, when you're changing things and you want to actually see a noticeable difference, the best thing to do is to change one thing at a time. I learned this from years and years and years in software, is that if you change too many things, you may notice a difference, but then you don't know which change actually caused the result. So the best thing you can do is just change one thing at a time, give it a test. One thing at a time, give it a test. That's effectively how we build software. If you follow this link, you'll get taken to an Adobe page. And this page will give you a few basic details on what it is that you're looking for here, right? If your Windows or your Mac computer has these specifications or better, use it. If not, perhaps turn it off. Fundamentally, that's it. You actually just need to give it a go yourself, okay? Try turning that on, try turning it off, try playing with those tick boxes and see the difference that it makes for you and your system. That's the key here. Here's a really, really cool one. Now, you may be all over this, in which case, awesome, good on you, hang loose. But if you're not, Lightroom, as of quite a few years ago, has the concept of smart previews. And smart previews are effectively smaller DNG versions of your raw files. When I say smaller, they're kind of like 2 meg as opposed to 30 meg. And they're wonderful because they contain enough information about your image for Lightroom to enable you to edit and do almost anything to the image. But because they're so unbelievably small compared to your raw file, they're so much quicker for Lightroom to read and apply edits on top of. There was a hack that a bunch of us used to do about a number of years ago where we would generate smart previews and then we'd unhook our hard drive so Lightroom was forced to read the smart previews. Lightroom's like, hey, I can't see your raw files, I'll use the smart previews instead. As soon as you plugged in the hard drive, Lightroom would revert to the raw files. Cool. Lightroom, or Adobe, they realized this was being used. They realized it was powerful. They've set up a tick box exactly to help you out here, and I'll show you what it is. You come along to Edit, Preferences. Again, under the Performance tab, you'll see here, use Smart Previews instead of Originals for image editing. By ticking that box and going OK, what Lightroom now does is it doesn't read the raw file. It will generate a Smart Preview, and it will use that nice little 2 meg DNG file for all your editing. Unbelievably awesome. One of the other secrets to this, to get the most out of it, to make Lightroom perform better for you with regards to these smart previews is to generate them in advance. If I'm in Lightroom and I'm jumping between images and I've told Lightroom, use smart previews, but I haven't generated them, well, Lightroom's going to have to go and create them for me every time. What I can do is I can use some of my downtime, some time when I'm making a coffee or not doing anything else with my computer to generate these previews. I love smart previews. So what we do is we select the images that we want. We say library, previews, build smart previews. It goes and creates them. And then when we're editing these images in Lightroom, it's using the smart preview rather than the raw file. They load quicker, you can edit them quicker, and everything about your experience is that much better. There's essentially one tiny little drawback, and that is that when you're editing these files, you may not necessarily see full quality or full resolution of the files. The truth is that if you're doing volume work, and if you're not really pixel peeping your files, you won't notice and you won't care. The smart thing about these smart previews is that when you export your files as JPEGs or TIFFs or whatever it is that you do, Lightroom then ignores the smart preview and goes and it applies all your edits to the raw file to then export it. So you still get maximum quality out of Lightroom. It's freaking wonderful. It's such a cool sneaky thing. So go and turn that checkbox on and watch your Lightroom just behave that much faster. Here's another one for you, right? Sort of counterintuitive, but when you generate standard previews, so we're not talking about smart previews, we're not talking about one-to-one previews, we're talking about standard previews, you can specify what size they are. And the key is to make them only the size of your monitor or smaller. Don't make them any bigger. Otherwise, you're basically wasting resource. Under Edit, Catalog Settings, kind of annoys me that this is in Catalog Settings. It should be under Preferences, I think. File Handling, Standard Preview Size. Mine's currently set to Auto, 3840. It's set to Auto 3840 because I've got a massive screen here with 3,840 pixels wide. The truth is that I never edit using that full screen size. I actually shrink my Lightroom down to about 2,560 pixels and just only use some of my real estate here. So why would I make my previews 3,800 pixels wide when I don't even need them to ever display that big? So what we do is we create them smaller. Of course, Lightroom wants to choose Auto because it thinks I might run Lightroom full screen, but I know I don't. So I'm going to overrule it here and I'm going to set it at 2,880 pixels. Yeah, my preview is small, but it's all I need. And then I'm not wasting time either generating, but more importantly, viewing these previews when I'm jumping between photos. This will make a difference, even if it is only a small one. There's another setting here, and by default it should be turned off, but I recommend, unless you really, really need this, unless this is important for you in your workflow, I recommend you ensure it is turned off. And it's known as Autowrite XMP. Again, it's under Catalog Settings rather than Preferences. And what this means is that if you do have a workflow where you use multiple catalogs for each event or throughout your year, you're going to have to change this every time, okay? I appreciate it. That's why I think it doesn't really belong in the catalog setting. It belongs in the performance setting. But anyway, here we are. You go to Metadata. Automatically write changes into XMP. An XMP file, if you don't realize, is a sidecar file. It's effectively a piece of XML in a text file that sits alongside your raw file, and it has as much of the detail of this file as you need written into that file. Sometimes it's a huge amount, sometimes it contains all of the information, all the edits and changes you've made to that file, yada, yada, yada. By writing changes to that file every time you make a change in Lightroom, you're just taking up extra processing and extra disk time. You don't need it, unless you do, in which case you can turn it on, but you'll know if you're using it or not. And if you have no idea what I'm talking about, untick the box. Make sure it is not written. Here's another few things for you. Now, Lightroom's trying to get funky, it's trying to get fancy, it's trying to be all modern and everything, and I get it. Don't get me wrong. But for purposes of what I'm doing here with this particular catalog, which is editing weddings and delivering weddings, I don't want any of these features. So what I do is I turn these features off. Edit, catalog settings, metadata, automatically detect faces in all photos. I don't want faces detected in my photos. I haven't found a use for that for my wedding clients yet. Turn it off. Next thing, address lookup. Let's pause it. Face detection. Let's pause it. And the last one, cloud. Let's pause cloud syncing. And in actual fact, we can probably go one step further and just make sure that we don't have any of these collections syncing with the cloud. Doesn't look like we do. Now remember, this is a personal thing. If you're using Lightroom Cloud Sync because you're syncing things between devices or to an iPad or something, awesome, turn it on. If you like the address lookup, because it provides value to whatever it is that you're doing in Lightroom, sweet as, you're going to need it, and same with face detection. I have multiple Lightroom catalogs, and one of my Lightroom catalogs is based around my mobile phone photos. I put all of my mobile photos into Lightroom. Sweet. I actually turn address lookup on for that because I like to have the address locations, and I turn face detection on. because I like it to scan through and find all the photos of my daughter, my son, my wife, etc. For my wedding work, I want it to run like a beast. I want none of that fluff. I just want to be able to edit and deliver. Now, there may come a time when I've figured something out and I've found it valuable and I use it. Right now, doesn't work in my workflow. Turn them off. Hey. I've taken you through hardware, catalog, and now performance settings. Now, the final thing I want to do is I want to show you some workflow changes or adjustments you can make to the way that you use Lightroom that might have a performance improvement. So let's get into it. So as crazy as this seems, the way that you use Lightroom can have an impact on its performance. And there are actual Adobe specified ways for how you should use Lightroom. I'm going to take you through a few of them. First one is this Histogram. Crazily, if you don't use it, if you don't actually refer to it, and I hardly do, turn it off. Get rid of it. Because every time that you jump between images, Lightroom has to read that image, and look how long it takes for that histogram to appear. By turning that off, look how much quicker Lightroom jumps between the images. The difference is actually quite remarkable. Just turn it off. Okay, maybe you use it from time to time. You can turn it back on. And if you want a shortcut key, Control-0, or in a Mac's case, must be Mac or Command or whatever that funny squiggly shape is, 0, will turn that histogram on and off for you. Consider up here your zoom options. Now, this is a little bit of a funny one, but typically Lightroom uses the fit, or it might even use the fill. And it basically fills up your whole area there with the image. Maybe it fits it in there. What's really interesting is that if you're prepared to do this, if you're prepared to go in here and choose one of these settings that's in here, and yet the image size is actually going to work for you with the size of your screen and the way that you edit, you might find that Lightroom runs a little bit quicker. So in my situation here, you'll notice that when I choose 33%, it's basically too big and I can't see the whole image. When I choose 25%, I can get the whole width in there, just not the whole height. So what I could potentially do is shrink this down, give myself a bit more height, or even turn the film strip off, or maybe even turn this bit off. And using the 25% setting, I can see my whole image in there. What that means is that you're using essentially like a preview, I guess, if you want, a preview that Lightroom has already gone and created for your image. You're using that, it's not a preview, but you know what I mean? You're using the equivalent, the one that Lightroom's already got, that's the perfect size every time, rather than the fit option, which is some other random size. And you're asking Lightroom to do that every time for every image. So, if one of these fits for you, if one of those settings that comes with Lightroom actually fits within your viewing window, change it and use it. And here's another one for you, straight from Adobe themselves. There's actually an order in which you should develop your photos. There's certain things you should do before other things. And by doing them in that order, you reduce the overhead of Lightroom having to perform certain things. You see, the way that editing in Lightroom works is you apply a change to your image, and Lightroom lists that in its little database, and you apply another change and another change and another change. And so what happens is all these changes all kind of stack on top of each other. And when you apply another change, Lightroom has to go and make that change to everything below it. And if some of those below changes, those changes you made early on your images, if some of those are really, really intense or effectively happen at like a pixel level, all the changes that happen on top of it effectively get slowed down. So the secret here is you do global changes before you do local changes. That's it in a nutshell. So what is global? Well, it's things like white balance, exposure, all of your highlights and your blacks, your presence, things like your texture and your vibrance, that's all global. And it's fair to say that even things like tone curve, HSL color, your color grading, all of that is all global adjustments as well. Then you want to move into your spot healing, your cloning, those kind of changes. Now, they're not that global, they're very, very local, but by doing them earlier on in the process, you improve the accuracy of them. So for instance, let's say I wanted to get rid of some dust on the floor, I'd be doing that next. Cleaning up my floor, amazing, done. And then the third thing in the order of operations is your geometry. Geometry is effectively transform. So in transform, we can change things. We can change all our angles. We can even crop and rotate. These things should come in to play at a third level. So if you're into cropping, if you're into keystoning, if you're into getting angles straight, which I am, do them third. And then fourth, you want to apply your local corrections. Those are effectively brushes. So in Lightroom, I might apply a gradient. I might put some sort of radial thing going on, bit of a vignette or something, if that's what I'm after for this photo, who knows. I might even go in and do some dodging and burning for whatever reason it is. Maybe there's something I want to do, something I want to highlight, something I want to bring attention to, or change the colour in something, whatever it is. But we're doing them fourth, effectively second to last. Reason being that they're intensive at a very, very specific level. And if you're doing them too early, it's harder for Lightroom to apply all your other changes on top of those. They're really, really intense changes, those sort of things. Then you want to go and you want to apply your detail correction. And your detail correction is essentially noise and sharpening. And what happens with a lot of people is they have the noise reduction and their sharpening built into their presets, and they may or may not tweak it much, but it's effectively applied from the start. And so the best thing that you can do if you want to really, really optimize Lightroom is to have your detail panel turned off. By turning off my detail panel, I've effectively got no sharpening, no noise reduction applied. And so Lightroom's effectively going to run a little bit faster without that being applied. The key is to make sure I come in and turn that on at the end before I export, or before I do some checks before I export. The other way to do it is to leave it turned on. So here it is turned on, but have these down at 0. 0 is the equivalent of it being off. A 0 amount of sharpening is effectively saying there is no sharpening. Therefore it's not been applied, therefore it's not impacting the image. As soon as I come in and put that from anywhere from 1 up to 100, or 150 in this case, it's changing that image substantially. And you can see the massive difference that sharpening, for instance, makes on an image. And so if you have a big catalogue, if you have a lot of photos, if you've got Lightroom not really running that well, one of the things I'd love you to do is to go in and turn off the detail panel, or go off and take all of your noise reduction and sharpening out of your presets and take them into another preset and apply them last as part of your export workflow. See if that makes a difference to the way it runs for you. So there we have it. Now, was that actually 20? I don't know. I kind of lost count. When I wrote it down, it was 20. Hopefully I covered all 20 for you. The idea is that there's a bunch of things that you can do to improve Lightroom. And I guarantee you that there's a couple of those in there that will make a substantial difference to the way Lightroom is running for you, because you either had the setting wrong or you hadn't considered playing with it and what a difference it might make. If you go through and you change all of those things for you, I can't help but feel that Lightroom will run like a beast for you, like it does for me. So, how'd you find that? Was it useful? Was it practical enough? Did I show you exactly what changes you need to make? Let me know in the comments whether you found some value in that, and if I can do another version where I actually take you through some of these pluses and minuses and show you the difference in my Lightroom between the two of them, because some of them are just remarkable for me. This is the part that I should have put at the start of the video, but I couldn't be bothered. This is the part where you get to know me, right? My name's Jason Naylor, and I'm a creative coach. I help creatives, specifically photographers, and at this stage wedding photographers, build a profitable, sustainable business that sustains their lifestyle and that gives them more time for the things they really, really enjoy in life. If that sounds like something you want to be a part of, hit the subscribe button, be a friend of me. I'd love to show you some more of this stuff. Thanks so much. See you next time.